semnale ferme la Bruxelles. În primul rând, este imperativ ca poziția de trimis special al Uniunii Europene pentru promovarea libertății de religie sau de credință în afara UE să nu mai fie o simplă funcție decorativă, blocată adesea în birocrație, ci să primească resursele, vizibilitatea și mandatul politic necesar pentru a acționa ca un adevărat avocat al creștinilor aflați în suferință.
Moreover, so that this is not just a thought and it's just rhetoric, we need a institutional mechanism from Brussels. First of all, it is highly important that the position as a special sent from the European Union for the promotion of religious freedom or faith outside the EU, not to be just a decorative function, blocked by bureaucracy, but to get the resources needed, the visibility and the political mandate necessary to act as a real advocate for the Christians in suffering.
Mai mult decât atât, ca europarlamentar din estul Europei, afirm cu tărie că structurile diplomatice ale Uniunii au o uriașă pată oarbă. Este esențială înființarea unui departament specializat în cadrul Serviciului European de Acțiune Externă, dedicat specific monitorizării și protejării comunităților creștin-ortodoxe.
More than that, as a European member of Parliament, I strongly say that the diplomatic structures of the European Union have a very bad spot. It is essential to set up a department specialized in the service of the European Union for their foreign policy that is dedicated specifically to monitorization and protection of the Orthodox Christian communities.
De la bisericile dărâmate sau confiscate în zonele de conflict din Orientul Mijlociu, până la presiunile geopolitice uriașe exercitate asupra patriarhiilor istorice, lumea ortodoxă se confruntă cu amenințări specifice, asimetrice, care necesită expertiză teologică, istorică și diplomatică de specialitate. Nu putem formula politici globale corecte dacă nu înțelegem realitatea profundă din teren.
If we think about the churches that are confiscated in the conflict zones from the Middle East, or if we think about the geopolitical pressures that are exercised upon the historical churches, the Orthodox world has to come face to specific threats, asymmetric threats that need theological expertise, historical and diplomatic specialty. We cannot set up global politics that are correct if we do not understand the real problem in each field.
Ex Oriente Lux nu este doar o expresie istorică, este o responsabilitate și o chemare.
Ex Oriente Lux is not just an historical saying, it's a responsibility and a calling for us.
Să plecăm astăzi de la Iași cu o hotărâre reînnoită, să ne apărăm credința acasă, să ne întărim instituțiile tradiționale și să fim un scut de nezdruncinat pentru frații și surorile noastre care suferă în întreaga lume.
Let's leave Iași today with a decision, a firm decision. Let's fight for our faith here at home. Let's strengthen our institution, our traditional institution, and let's be a shield that cannot be brought down for our brothers and sisters who suffer in the whole world.
Vă mulțumesc și Dumnezeu să ne binecuvânteze națiunile.
Thank you and God bless our nations.
Mai departe, alături de noi, îl invit pe domnul președinte al Comisiei pentru Cultură din Parlamentul României, domnul deputat Mihail Neamțu.
Georgiana, thank you. Good morning, everybody. I shall speak in English. I suppose if I speak in English, there's no need to translate from here. So once again, it's a great joy, it's a great honor to see this event taking place in the heart of Moldova here in Iași. But I will go straight into the matter by telling you how important it is for you to spend perhaps more than 2 or 3 hours in the morning by listening to great speakers, because we've done our best to bring the best, and I'm especially proud and moved by the fact that one of the best minds in America and in the world indeed today, who is able to speak from the conservative perspective in terms of political philosophy and defending our Western civilization, has agreed to come here at the invitation of our beloved friends from New Direction, and that is Professor Daniel Mahoney, who is indeed a professor emeritus of Assumption University in the United States, senior fellow at the Claremont Institute, and also winner of the very prestigious Prix Raymond Aron in France, a prize that one might note is awarded by the French, and the French do not part easily with intellectual honors. Daniel Mahoney has spent 4 decades doing something that has become quietly subversive in our age, that is thinking clearly about what is true, what is good, and what is destroying the beautiful institutions of our civilization. There are scholars who write books, but then there are scholars who write books that bite back, and I think Daniel Mahoney belongs to the more dangerous latter category. And of course, when we read Daniel Mahoney, and we could read this book, which was just printed in Romanian, we will realize who are his mentors. And his mentors are, of course, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, an Eastern Orthodox Russian intellectual who suffered under communism because of the traumatic experience of totalitarianism. Then, of course, one of his mentors is, may I say, Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky. Perhaps I should also add Pierre Manon, who is also a very, very important conservative Catholic philosopher. These are not names you encounter in the average political science department. They are names you encounter in the kind of mind that has decided calmly, firmly, with well-documented footnotes, that the 20th century greatest lesson was not progress but warning. So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, let me introduce you a wonderful friend, a great intellect, a great defender of our Western civilization, Professor Mahoney. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that exceedingly gracious introduction, and I'm very happy to be here. I'm remarkably alert, given the fact that it's 2:45 in the morning at home. And I'm trying to abstract from that fact, even though I just reminded myself of it. But so far, so good. And by the way, I'm very, very pleased to see the picture of Mrs. Thatcher. You know, I once had the occasion of spending a couple of days with her in Fulton, Missouri, on the 50th anniversary of Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain speech. And it was quite a memorable occasion. And although the Churchill family was a little annoyed because throughout the event, Mrs. Thatcher referred to Churchill by his first name, Winston. You know, they were on, and one of the daughters said to me, well, you know, I don't think she even knew him, but in any case, Mrs. Thatcher is clearly a great partisan of liberty and equally important for our concerns, a indefatigable defender of sovereign nations, you know, and that theme has become more prescient and pertinent as the years have gone by. Today I'd like to speak about I'd like to speak about the sort of deeper thought, the deeper truths that ought to underlie or undergird the defense of liberty and human dignity and the opposition to the totalitarian scourge of the 20th century. But I have a relatively recent book out called The Persistence of the Ideological Lie, the Totalitarian Impulse Then and Now. I chose my language very carefully. I don't want to suggest that we're living under some full-fledged totalitarianism, but I do want to suggest that the totalitarian impulse, a kind of Manichaeanism that roots good and evil not in the human heart, but in suspect groups who, as I said yesterday, the tendency to replace the perennial and absolutely necessary distinctions between good and evil and truth and falsehood by the pernicious ideological distinction between progress and reaction. At least in the Anglo-American world, those categories are dominant in education. They subvert moral good sense, common sense, decent politics all at once. And to come back to Mihai Neamtu's remarks, it makes a huge difference if one thinks of human liberty and dignity in the context of the search for and affirmation of the old transcendentals, the true, the good, and the beautiful, or whether one draws, I would say, a kind of pernicious ideological lesson from the totalitarian episode of the 20th century. I'm going to call it Isaiah Berlinism. Isaiah Berlin was a English, I suppose, historian of ideas, some might say a philosopher, I wouldn't. Quite a talker, a very learned man, but Berlin argued that the root of the totalitarian temptation was succumbing to what he called monism. In other words, the problem with communism, like every totalitarian ideology, was an inordinate concern for truth. And so the proper lesson to be drawn, you might say, from the short 20th century, as Anna Akhmatova called it, beginning in 1914 and ending in 1989, 1990, was we ought above all to eschew the search for truth. That kind of monism, that kind of absolutism always leads in practice to totalitarian solutions. And I'll tell you, in 1992, the New Republic, which was then an estimable liberal magazine, now it's what I will call in salty English a woke rag. But in 1992, they ran an article by the relativistic, pragmatist American philosopher Richard Rorty, who believed that things like truth, good, and the beautiful were just linguistic constructions. And he wrote a review of some new books that have come out in English by the Czech phenomenologist and philosopher Jan Patočka. And in the review, he said, Patočka is clearly a noble man who suffered terribly under communism from 1948 on. He died being interrogated by the Czech secret police, the STB. But he says there's something a little disturbing about his writings. He writes about living in truth as if it's a meaningful concept rather than a useful metaphor. Because there is no truth. There are simply more or less pragmatic arrangements that can serve the cause of social justice or human progress, etc. So it really struck me that Richard Rorty was really intent on saying to Anglo-American readers, the witness of a man like Patočka. By the way, Patočka was largely, I think, there's a spiritual dimension to his thought, but he was not a man, I think, of deep religious conviction. But nonetheless, the idea that a serious human life needs to be grounded in the affirmation and search for truth was just considered by Rorty to be too primitive to be taken seriously by, contemporary academics and intellectuals. And so I've always believed that the serious ground of opposition to totalitarianism, and as importantly, of course, the positive affirmation of truth, of the true, the good, and the beautiful, is necessarily grounded in a substantial account of the human person, in a reference that there, in an understanding, a deep and abiding recognition that there is something more fundamental than the human will. That there's a natural order of things, and that natural order of things is informed by a recognition of the Creator, who is the source of that natural order, and certainly infuses our lives and our souls with dignity and grace. And by the way, I think the problem with, let's say, the Marxism of Marx was not its intolerant commitment to truth. Eric Voegelin liked to say about, Eric Voegelin was a Austrian-born political philosopher, a very wise man, although he's never gained, I think, the wide recognition in the academy that he deserved, although he's a serious thinker for people who are themselves serious. But in any case, Voegelin said in his book Science, Politics, and Gnosticism in 1959 that Marx specialized in forbidding Socratic interrogation, the famous what is questions. What is justice? What is the good? What is the beautiful? Marx has a famous paragraph in Part 2 of 1848's Communist Manifesto where he says, I refuse to answer any objections to communism raised in the name of philosophy, religion, or natural justice, or natural right. In other words, Marx said, shut up. These are illicit categories. And we all know that, the Marxian abstruse categories of consciousness and being, that all thought about these matters is simply a product of underlying socioeconomic determinants and everything. It's the death of the soul. It's the death of inquiry. It's the death of wonder. And of course, my students years ago, when I first started teaching in 1986, my students would say to me, well, they didn't know very much. 18-year-olds know next to nothing, which is a good argument against woke despotism. We really don't want 18-year-olds telling you how to structure the human world. But in any case, they would say to me, well, Marxism is good in theory, but maybe it doesn't work in practice. So I would always say to them, look at Part 2 of the Communist Manifesto. I mean, it's not Marx's deepest work, but the effectual truth, the verita effectuelle of Marxism is all there. And Marx famously puts forward 4 abolitions. The abolition of private property. Communism can be summed up in a single sentence: the abolition of private property. The abolition of the family, which he sometimes calls, we might call the natural family. He sometimes called it the bourgeois family, but the family in any form. By the way, communist regimes experimented with that for a year or two. Kolontai in the Soviet Union, feminism and abolition of family. It wasn't workable, so it got pushed by the by. The third abolition, of course, was the nation. Marxism, in principle at least, was cosmopolitan, internationalist, or as we would say today, globalist. It aimed at what the French Hegelian-Marxist philosopher Alexander Kojève called the universal homogeneous state. And the fourth abolition, and I think really central to the heart and soul of Marxism, was the abolition of religion. Religion, for Marx, was famously the opiate of the people. It was a reflection, the oppressed side of the proletariat, who turned to mythical effusions about a spiritual order to take them away from the class struggle necessary to bring an end to the prehistory of humankind, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I don't find anything particularly true in theory in the four abolitions. I find nothing less than the abolition of man. Any society that made progress in that direction would undercut, undermine, if not mutilate and destroy the true grounds of liberty and human dignity. And it's very, very odd that the Marxism of Marx remained so tantalizing for 20th century intellectuals, so seemingly sophisticated. And it was often naively identified, like by progressive churchmen as so close to the Christian spirit, I fail to see the Christian affinities of the Marxism of Marx. There's a long debate in the political theory of totalitarianism, of Marxism, those who say was the Georgian tyrant who was the head of the General Secretary of the Communist Party from 1924 to 1953 in the Soviet Union. Vladimir Lenin had a couple of strokes in 1922, but he was, of course, the founding father of the Soviet state and the, you might say, co-doctrinal official ideologist of the Soviet state, Marxist-Leninism. And, of course, there's the Marxism of Marx. So there's always been an argument. Stalinism corrupted true Leninism. Khrushchev made that argument in 1956. Even Gorbachev made that argument in 1985. It's not very persuasive. Going back to Leninist norms, good luck. Leninist norms are as inherently totalitarian as Stalinist norms. I think Leszek Kolakowski's position, as articulated in his 3-volume masterwork, Main Currents of Marxism, gets things just right. Stalinism, Leninist Stalinism, is not the only possible theoretical and practical outcome of the Marxism of Marx, but it's a plausible and even likely one. And so the idea that there's no connect. Alistair McIntyre is sort of a left-wing Catholic, historicized neo-Thomist, whatever that means. He liked to say, now that communism is finished, we can, get serious about Marx again. He wasn't a Marxist, but he was soft on Marxism. I think that's a silly and unpersuasive position, but it sounds good. We don't like, really existing socialism, but now we can turn to the Marxism of Marx. All right. Now, and by the way, I want to add one other reference, an Orthodox reference about Marx and Marxism, and that is the great Russian Orthodox theologian Sergius Bulgakov, who began as an atheist, became a philosophical critic of progressivism and communism, eventually became an Orthodox priest, and of course spent many years in exile in Paris, articulating, creating one of the great Orthodox theologies. Some of it is controversial, the stuff about Sophia, and but in any case, he wrote a book in 1905 called Karl Marx as a Religious Type. And I recommend the book to you. It's available in Russian and French and English. I have no idea if it's available in Romanian, but Father Bulgakov argued that Marx was a type, and he was the prototype of the kind of human being, to put it very simply. And this point had been observed, way back at the time of the full radicalization of the French Revolution. But he was the type of theorist and activist who hated real human beings while espousing the cause of humanity with a capital H. You go to Paris, you go to any kiosk, you can still buy on the street corner the Communist Party newspaper, L'Humanité, humanity. Run for the hills when people evoke humanity with a capital H. It has very little to do with the defense of the human person or the human soul, or to come back to the phrase I've used several times today, liberty and human dignity. All right, now I'm going to turn to Alexander Solzhenitsyn, whose thought is near and dear to me and who very misunderstood figure, I think, but Solzhenitsyn was born in December 1918, December 11, 1918. People born that year in the Soviet Union were called Lenin's children because supposedly they were completely unmarked by the prehistory of humanity. But Solzhenitsyn's family was quite Orthodox, and he was raised mainly, his father died in a hunting accident. He had been an officer in the Tsarist armies and was killed 6 months before Solzhenitsyn was born. So he was raised by his mother Taissa and his aunt Irina. And he was raised in a very serious Orthodox household, and they were persecuted as enemies of the people, etc. And Solzhenitsyn writes in a series of memoirs that he held off for a long time, till about the age of 15. He wore a crucifix, went to school with a crucifix around his neck and all that. That could not have been advisable in the 1920s or the early 1930s. But when he was about 15, he tore the crucifix from his neck. He joined Komsomol. And he says in his 7,000-word play, Dorshenka, The Trail of the Road, that he, about his spiritual and intellectual itinerary. He wrote it in the camps without pen and paper. He used a rosary made by Lithuanian Catholic friends, and they made that with little pieces of bread, an extra long rosary, and he memorized this 7,000-word autobiographical work. In any case, he talks about having been totally indoctrinated, totally won over by the most strident and a liberal kind of Marxist-Leninism. And on his honeymoon in 1940, he says he even got up early to read Das Kapital. Highly unrecommended on your honeymoon or elsewhere. But in any case, when Solzhenitsyn was arrested in February 1944, he was captain of the Red Army in East Prussia. He had written some letters to a friend who was, and they weren't too smart. They were referred to Stalin as the boss, the Pekan, like a mob boss and all that. And Smersh, the counterintelligence service, knew who they were talking about. He was arrested, spent 11 years in prison camp in exile. And very early on, he says, the scales of ideology began to fall from his eyes. He said that for the first time in his life, he had serious discussions about the nature of truth, about the journey of the soul. He was exposed to real philosophy, to some smattering of Orthodox theology, all in the camps, not in free Soviet life. And there's a wonderful poem, Akathistis, a song of praise from in the central chapter of the Gulag, in the section called Soul of Barbed Wire, The Ascent. And it's a poem prayer that Solzhenitsyn wrote in 1951. He says, great God of the universe, I believe again. So by 1950, 1951, he not only had completely rejected what he called the progressivist doctrine, and a very, that term, a kind of Sidarnic reference to the progressive doctrine, is hundreds of those references in the Gulag. Because Solzhenitsyn had nothing but unrelieved contempt for the progressive doctrine. By 51, he was on his path back not only to theism, but to what eventually would become a recognizable and robust Orthodox faith. Solzhenitsyn, you'll find nothing theological in Solzhenitsyn's writings. No references to kenosis, theosis, sobernost, and all that. He's not a theologian. But he's profoundly in tune, you might say, with the spiritual wisdom of the ages. And I'm going to begin later, 1993, while still in the United States, during his 20 years of forced exile. Solzhenitsyn gave a speech. He got the award from the National Arts Club, which is a group of literati. It's very unusual that they would have picked Solzhenitsyn, but Solzhenitsyn decided to use that occasion to speak about the postmodern clouding over of truth. His speech was called playing upon the strings of emptiness. And speaking at the New York Arts Club on January 19, 1993, Solzhenitsyn lamented the moral and intellectual poverty, quote, the forced playing upon the strings of emptiness, unquote, that informs the easygoing postmodern celebration of nothingness, where the denizens of postmodernism or deconstruction see, you know, by the way, you attack good sense, you attack, you know, the perennial wisdom of the ages, and you're being transgressive. You know, how wonderful it is to be transgressive, to mock the old verities. But Solzhenitsyn says where they play, he discerns a willful rejection of genuine joy. So joy has spiritual foundations, but transgressive play is simply a sophisticated kind of nihilism. And Solzhenitsyn added, in this deeply perverted view of the writer's or intellectual's task, the radical rejection of antiquated tradition goes hand in hand with a deep-seated hostility toward any spirituality. And Solzhenitsyn goes on to refer to the reckless cult of novelty that barely conceals, he wrote, I quote, an unyielding and long-sustained attempt to undermine, ridicule, and uproot all moral concepts. And he talks about the Silver Age in Russia. You know, it was a great age of poetry and literary renewal, but he says too many of them were imbibed with a kind of spirit of futurism, a kind of disdain for old verities. There's a wonderful line in I think the second greatest chapter of the Gulag Archipelago called The Blue Caps. And Solzhenitsyn is discussing why, when he was a 17-year-old Marxist-Leninist, you know, completely taken in by the ideological claims of the regime, when the NKVD came to his high school to recruit, and he said, I should have been a likely candidate, an enthusiastic candidate. It would have been recognition, it would have been money, it would have been granting you power over life and death, it would have been in accord with Marxist-Lenin ideology, but he said, instead, the thought of becoming a secret police agent or interrogator filled me with revulsion. And he said, why? He says, we were saved by the copper coins left to us by our grandparents from a time when the distinction between good and evil was not merely relative. So he may have been one of Lenin's children born in 1918, but that capital of another age, of Orthodox Russia, of simply the, you might say, the inheritance of Western civilization, in some ways it saved him. All right, how many am I having? 5 more minutes? 10 more minutes? Okay, 5, okay. So, and I think this has nothing to do with, you know, some kind of reactionary blindness to modern thought or modern progress. I think Solzhenitsyn thought that the whole worldview that undergirded both Marxist-Leninist nihilism, if I can call it that, and postmodern nihilism was based on a complete rejection of the deep and true presuppositions that make life meaningful. And Solzhenitsyn liked to say that the worst thing about the idiocratic or ideological regime, its twin pillars, he said, were violence and lies. But he says the lies were the worst. The suffocation of the human soul by utterly untenable beliefs and prejudice. Not only claims, you know, Elena Ceausescu was the greatest scientist on earth, you know, that's hard for a reasonable human being to affirm, but more fundamental lies that reduce human beings to nothing but material agents or playthings of the historical process, etc. And Solzhenitsyn wrote in a 1988 work, he said that for him, that was the most intolerable part, was betrayal as a form of existence and systematic lying or mendacity as a form of existence. Yes, the death tolls, especially in the Soviet Union, but also in a place like Romania, in the 50s and 60s, and of course, to a lesser extent after that, the Ceausescu period was high. But it was the spiritual suffocation that was truly intolerable. And the spiritual suffocation, Solzhenitsyn believed, was rooted in utterly false premises about human nature. So here's a quote from Solzhenitsyn from a 1993 interview with the German newspaper Die Zeit. He says, "My view is very different from Rousseau's. It was a weighty effort to declare that man is by nature good and is corrupted by the environment, by the circumstances. I have always insisted repeatedly that the line dividing good and evil runs not between states, not between parties, not between nations, but through the heart of every human being. Man, by his nature, is prone to both good and evil." And of course, that's really a summation of the central message of the Gulag Archipelago. I want to read you a second quote from one of Solzhenitsyn's great novels, In the First Circle. There, a character named Volodin, who had been a self-proclaimed Epicurean, Marx wrote his dissertation on Epicurus and Democritus. And so it's not surprising that this Soviet diplomat, on the one hand, he's a Marxist, he's an apparatchik. On the other hand, Marxism gives him kind of excuse to sort of see his pleasure, as the substitute, you might say, for the drama of good and evil in the human soul. But in any case, Volodin, who ends up making a phone call to the American embassy exposing a nuclear espionage by the Soviets in the United States, he has this great metanoia, this great conversion. And at one point he says, "Look, I used to believe we only have one life to live. But now I believe we really only have one conscience to uphold." And by the way, Solzhenitsyn and his character Volodin didn't mean conscience in the contemporary subjectivistic, relativist sense. Meant it in the sense that the conscience gives us access to the truth of the moral order, and that there was something utterly compelling about the requirements of conscience. And lastly, Solzhenitsyn's message, he said in his letter to the Soviet leaders, it was a letter he wrote in 1973. He sent it to Brezhnev and the Politburo. They never got a response, of course. But he said, "Look, you can hold on to your dictatorship, but give up the ideology, give up the collective farms, give up the persecution of religion." He says, "I ask for no special privileges for Christianity, but I see it as the only spiritual force that can lead to authentic healing and to the rejuvenation of society and the human soul." And of course, Sakharov and the liberal dissenters attacked him for obscurantism and Tsarism. What's Tsarist about that? And anyway, what was so bad about the Tsars compared to the Soviet period? But never mind. But Solzhenitsyn's message was very misunderstood because his two central leitmotifs were repentance and self-limitation. His wonderful 1974 essay from Under the Rubble. The images were coming out from under the rubble, but how we do it is all important. Repentance and self-limitation in the life of nations. And Solzhenitsyn said, liberty is absolutely essential. The last chapter of the Gulag Archipelago is entitled, There Is No Law. But Solzhenitsyn was also very critical of mere legalism as opposed to a Rechtsstaat or the rule of law. But here's a very relevant passage from that essay, that 1974 essay. After the Western ideal of unlimited freedom, he meant the contemporary Western ideal, because of course, he says in the Harvard Address, the American founders believed that freedom needed to be undergirded by personal responsibility, including religious responsibility. But in the West, increasingly, freedom had come to mean self-expression, be yourself, autonomy, freedom from restraint. After the Marxist concept of freedom as the acceptance of the yoke of necessity, Here is the true Christian definition of freedom. Freedom is self-restriction, restriction of the self for the sake of others, question mark. And I will say this, the affirmation of repentance and self-limitation as intrinsic human goods that ultimately, I think, have a deep philosophical and theological underpinning, but are also simply available to the lived experience of human beings, people who want to live conscientious lives. It is so countercultural today that this message is seen as illiberal. But Solzhenitsyn always spoke of voluntary self-limitation. He wasn't talking about political coercion. He wasn't talking about despotism. But it was so striking that our petty and stupid journalists could see in the message of repentance and self-limitation nothing but a call for authoritarianism or political repression. In any case, if I had more time, I would share with you, I've done an intensive analysis of the 3 public prayers Solzhenitsyn wrote in his lifetime. I've already referred to the Song of Praise that he includes in the Gulag Archipelago. It's very, very beautiful. And it really is, I mean, the sense of joy that accompanies the throwing out of these ideological categories that get in the way of wisdom and serenity. Another poem he wrote upon the publication, Solzhenitsyn was briefly published in the Soviet Union, most famously his novella, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. He wrote a poem thanking God, you know, saying, I have this wholly unexpected worldly fame, but he says, I owe everything to you. And he always said, I dedicate everything I do to the mission, to the memory of the Zeks. You know, the prisoners who perished in the camps, that he saw this as a providential mission. And so many of his critics said, I mean, I think he's God, he thinks he's a prophet, you know, but they've been given a task by God to tell the truth about the intrinsic mendacity and criminality of the communist regime. And of course, the spiritual and political and civilization alternative to those violence and lies. That was his great task. And the third great prayer Solzhenitsyn wrote was in 1927. It was called A Prayer for Russia. And as Solzhenitsyn wrote at the time, Russia has come out from under the rubble in the worst possible way. So he prayed that God not forget the long, you know, the confused and suffering Russian people. But these prayers are very, very moving, as again, they don't have any specifically theological content or categories, but they're infused, I think, with a deep and thoughtful piety that, and Solzhenitsyn even said, even though he was a deep patriot, although a patriot who thought that critical love of country was the key, including the spirit of repentance, he thought that, he said in a 1998 work, if Russia were to cease to exist, which was all too painful for Solzhenitsyn, he said, but if the Orthodox religion survived, he said, that would still be a great gift, and that would still be a great consolation for the people of the modern world. Thank you.
Mulțumim foarte mult. Thank you very much. I think we are switching right now to another moment, a panel, and I think you, Richard, are supposed to be chairing the panel. I will invite all the panelists. Once again, thank you very much for Daniel Mahoney. Once again, a round of applause for Professor Mahoney. And Richard, you are kindly invited, and all the members of the panel, you know who you are, please take the podium. O să vă rugăm să aveți un pic de răbdare pentru a asculta și acest panel și apoi va exista și o pauză. Okay.
Bună dimineața, dragi prieteni romani. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ryszard Czarnecki. I'm from Poland, and I have the great privilege to be the moderator of this first panel. Firstly, I would like to thank the organizers of this very important conference for inviting me and for the opportunity to moderate this very prestigious debate. Special thanks for the Romanian representative on the board of New Direction, Professor Georgiana Maria Todorescu, influential member of the European Parliament. Mulțumesc, Georgiana. Secondly, I would like to introduce our distinguished panelists, our speakers. Mr. Vlad Mureșan from Romania, scientist, lecturer of Babes Bolyai University. Mario Fantini from Italy, editor-in-chief of the European Conservative. He's panelist in this panel, but also moderator. And last but not least, our guest from Slovakia, Andrej Kolarik, lawyer, judge, be careful, ladies and gentlemen, judge, and executive director of the Conservative Summit of the Ladislav Hanus Institute. The structure of our debate is very simple. Firstly, my short, not too long introduction. Secondly, first round for our panelists, 3 speeches. And second round, your answer for my questions. Few remarks before our debate from my side. It is an honor to be here with you at this exceptional conference. Why exceptional? Exceptional because it concerns not politics or elections, which are most interest to politicians, frankly speaking, but something perhaps more important: culture, civilization, religion, and this should, I can repeat, and this should interest politicians most. Now, forgive me for quoting him at the Conservative Conference, nobody's perfect. Karl Marx knew that alongside the economic base, the ideological superstructure is crucial. In the long term, conservative policies only make sense if they fight, if we fight, for traditional values in universities, school, culture, films, theater, and literature. If we conservatives don't do this, we will lose, even if we win another election on the fly. I quoted Marx here, I'm sorry, it's never again. And it's like an Alfred Hitchcock film. It was an earthquake, and that it gets even more dramatic because, to quote President of the European Commission, don't worry, not Ursula Gertrude von der Leyen, but former President of the European Commission, Jacques Delors, for 10 years the President of the European Commission in Brussels, asked after leaving Brussels what he would do differently if he could run the European Commission again. He replied that the biggest mistake was not addressing culture. Well, I think good lesson for us. Let's not repeat the mistakes of the bureaucrats. Let's not step into the shoes of Brussels and its leader. Finally, speaking, and that is also why this conference exists, to show how important religion and culture are for Europe, and for which religion is the reference point. It's the end of my short introduction. And now time for our panelists. Obviously, I can repeat. In the second round, I'll ask each of you one question. Afterward, there will be the time for our common debate. First speaker, Mr. Vlad Moreshan, one of the hosts of our conference. Please.
Sorry, I have a tendency to sing with the mic, not to speak with the mic. So a very short introduction to a question we all address, which seems to be a pretty easy question. Actually, it's very confusing. What is Europe? What is the West? It used to be a common sense. Now nobody knows exactly what is the West, what are European values. Most of the times they are not values, nor European. So we have a lot of obscurity surrounding the topic. So let me provide a short summarization of how Europe came to be in order to grasp some firm notion, to bring some clarity to the notion of the West we are all concerned about. You have the original of sacred history, primitive sacred, you have polytheistic religions. What does it mean? It means you don't have a unity, infinite unity. You have this original sacred intuition pulverized, fractured into many multiple essences, which is, we call them the play of imagination in mythological religions. So therefore you have a finite gods, but no infinity. Then you have the opposite, completely opposite metaphysical vision, because every civilization is the realization of a metaphysical vision. That's why metaphysics is important. Religions is important to understand. You have pantheistic religions, which is precisely the opposite. You have a substantial infinity. God is everything, and there's no autonomous, self-subsistence. The finite is desubstantialized. The world is an illusion, nature is an illusion, even man is an illusion, so nothing holds firm. So you have this ocean of divinity, and there's no opposing reality with endowed with some sort of autonomous self-subsistence. So therefore you have infinite without a finite. Mirroring polytheistic religions which are finite without infinite. Then you have a superior spiritual progress in the Persian dualism. You have finite and infinite. They are both present, they are both real, but they are fighting each other like light and the dark. You have the world is a struggle, everything is conflict, everything is opposition, everything is political somehow. So you have dualism, which is a new religion, basically, a new spiritual configuration in the progression of spiritual forms. However, you have them colliding, and there's no unity. It will be only triumph at the end of history, light conquering darkness somehow. So this is extremely manichaeistic somehow. And eventually, you have a new revelation in history, you have monotheistic religions. We are beyond the finite polytheistic mythologies, we are beyond pantheistic deconstruction of the finite into the substance of the infinite divinity. We have divine and humans mirroring each other somehow. Both are endowed with reality. The world is real, it's not an illusion. God is real, it's not an illusion. And there's no fight, just like in dualism in Persian religion. So you don't have an oppositional religion. The finite, the world is actually affirming God's majesty. However, what will be missing in the monotheistic traditions, the Old Covenant as well as the Quran, is a complete full unification of the finite and the infinite, because they are in a dialogue man and God. They share a word, they share a dialogue, they are facing each other. However, the only unity, I would call it, it's kind of formal unity. I mean, man complying with the sacred law comes closer to God. This is monotheistic religion. That's the utmost, the maximum that's really accessible to humanity. However, the next stage of the history of religions would be monotheist, a new monotheist religion, but which is the fulfillment of the original monotheism. And it's, I could call it Christological monotheism, because it's about a unification, a plenary unification of the finite and the infinite in the doctrine of Christological unity of God and man. The incarnational vision in which the infinite is real, the finite is real, and they are not formally united, but they are really united incarnationally in Christ. And that's a new form of plenary monotheistic, which is Christological monotheism. Now, why is this important? Because every civilization is nothing but the incarnation, historical, civilizational incarnation of a metaphysical vision. And I'm articulating here with a very important Romanian philosopher and who has a very important thesis, it's Constantin Noica, who makes an argument in his book about the European ontological model, stating that actually Europe was not born in 900 like Spengler used to believe, somewhere in the northern Europe in the midst of the northern forest, but actually half of a millennia previously in Byzantium during the Council of Nicaea. Because this is the first time and place in history where this new formula, the crystallization of the Christological doctrine, uniting finite and infinite, which is the most all-comprehensive conceptual totality. Because you have not just finite without infinite, nor infinite without the finite, nor the pure opposition of finite and infinity, and not even abstract monotheism like Old Covenant relation of God and man, but you have the incarnational unity of the finite and infinite in Christ. And Noica makes the argument, forceful argument, that Europe was born at the Council of Nicaea, which is this all-comprehensive notion of real material unity of the finite and infinite. Okay, where do we stand now? There's something new coming about, changing, altering somehow this definition of the West, definition of Europe, European civilization. Because you have modernity, which it's self-identifying as a progress, moral, rational, and material progress of humanity, to the point of destroying, eventually achieving inside the Western, within the Western philosophy, reaching to a point of actually deconstructing this sublime unity of the finite and the infinite. Because modern atheism, how could this fit in our structure, in our ontological schema? It's actually finite against infinity. It's a world in which you have man against the very notion of the divine, and which is presented as a sort of emancipation, revolutionary emancipation of humanity, but actually it has grown to be quite the opposite, because basically modernization in its first inception was mostly associated with revolutionary terror. You have the Jacobin tyranny, which is original for the whole modern project. I say you cannot identify modernity with democratization or pluralism when the very first political regime that's acclaimed as the culmination of modernization is associated with the Jacobin terror. Then the communist revolution, this idea that the finite is oppositionally oriented against the infinite, has political consequences, like the finite humanity is authorized to completely reconstruct divine and natural order with no restraint somehow, which makes modernization precisely the opposite of the old notion of a millennia of European history, which was dedicated and constructed under this notion of a synthesis between finite and infinite. So you have a completely different metaphysics at play, and we should be able to distinguish between this European heritage and this experimental notion of modernization, which is the finite against the infinite, which has a political consequence we call utopia. And we must be on guard against this mobile, active negativity, which presents itself as European, however, being nothing else than a negation of the original European synthesis. Thank you very much.
Signore Mario Fantini, per favore, prego.
Thank you.
Sorry about that. Good morning, everyone. I live in Vienna, and as you probably know, it's full of coffee houses. Last summer, I had a very interesting conversation with a group of young European Catholics, and they were quite impressive. They had read everything, all the books. They could talk about patristic anthropology, the natural law tradition. They referred to Alistair MacIntyre, Pierre Manon, Cardinal Ratzinger, Solzhenitsyn, et cetera, et cetera. I was quite impressed. But this is what I remember the most about that conversation. At the end, they said, you know, we know the tradition. We know what the tradition teaches. What we don't know is how to live with it, how to live this tradition in our world today. And I think that's a conundrum or a conflict or a challenge that a lot of us, especially young people, are facing today. And I think this is the kind of question that kind of undergirds or underlies this panel and the question about institutions and the formation of people. I think we all know that individuals are formed not only by books, but more importantly by these institutions of society, the family, the church, clubs, different associations. And that those institutions that used to transmit the tradition, that used to form the individual, are no longer fulfilling that function. That, I think we all know that. And it's been like that for decades, and nothing seems to be improving. The other point I want to bring up, somewhat related to that, is that there's a distinction that we have to make between discipline and formation. Now, we live in a world where there's a lot of mechanisms and systems that discipline us, that control our behavior, that manage our conduct. In the workplace, there's mechanisms that ensure that we're disciplined, that we do our duty. Our schools discipline our children. The social media censors and coordinators, commentators, they discipline us in what we say or don't say. That's really very, very different from formation, which is what we should be moving toward, what we used to have. And what do I mean by formation? I think if you talk to a priest, he will be able to explain it very well, this concept of spiritual formation. But it goes beyond the spirit. We're talking about the formation of the whole person, the body and the intellect, the formation of your desire, your impulses, and your will. All of these used to be ordered toward a particular end, a telos, an end that we learned about through these institutions of society. So the monastery, the monasteries, I mean, there are many in this region, formed individuals because the monastery served and operated as a community in which the individual was formed and learned. The family forms the individual. You're embedded into that family. Your father and mother, grandmother, grandfather form you. They transmit to you all these lessons and all this wisdom from the past. And the university, well, no longer, but the university used to form students and individuals because it was a community gathered around this idea that the university was the place where you sought truth. You were there to seek the truth. One quick aside, I have to mention this, and Dan, you might know this. It was revealed a few years ago that some of the Ivy League universities, like Yale, Harvard, Princeton, in the old days, didn't just form the intellect of the students, but they actually formed them in how to dress, how to stand, posture. There were photographs they found at Yale. There were all incoming students were photographed to see if their spine was, curved, and if they stood up like a lady and a gentleman. That's crazy to think about today. Imagine a university doing that stuff today. But my point is, the university back then, the good universities formed you as an intellectual, as a scholar, and as a lady or gentleman, as a future citizen of society. That's all gone, sadly. I have to, if you don't mind, I have to show you the cover of the magazine I publish. This is a recent edition. What you see there, it's a family. That's what I was talking about. The family, the father and mother, form the children. But what do you see in the window? You can't see it in the back, but it's the modern threat to the family. On one side, you have a transgender activist with colored hair. And on the other side is, a doctor or an engineer from the Middle East or North Africa. So I'll give this to one of you. Whoever wants it can take it home. Let's talk about the family a little bit more, just briefly. And I'm aware of the time, but you'll cut me off if I go over. The family, some have said, is one of the most exhaustively studied institutions in the whole Western tradition. There's so many books and studies that focus on the family. And yet, much of that contemporary discussion about the family, its purpose, what it's for, focuses again on the disciplining aspects, not the formative or formational aspects. So you have studies and books and scholars who talk about how to discipline your child, or whether you should be a gentle parent or a strict parent. These are important questions, but there's a more important question that all these studies and books seem to overlook. What is the purpose of the family? What is the family ordered toward? What is its ultimate purpose? What is its telos? The pre-modern Christian answer was quite clear. The family was a sort of domestic church. It was ordered toward the worship of God, toward the transmission of faith. You transmitted it from the grandfather to the father to the son. The family was where you prepared your souls for eternal life. The family discipline, yes, but in the service of formation, its ultimate purpose. That's so very different from the modern liberal understanding of what the family is for, where the family is just an amalgamation of autonomous individuals. They just happen to live in the same house and share the same meals. And then in the end, it's all emancipatory. The family is really just, eventually you want to liberate yourself from the family. You will become this independent individual out in the world doing your things. It's a very distorted version or understanding of the family. I have to mention, I've been learning more about Byzantium and the Eastern Christian tradition, and I think the Eastern Christian tradition still remains quite clear as to the purpose of the family. I came across this as I read the call for papers that Mikhail, who was just seated there, brought up. Dumitru Stanilau, is that correct? Thank you. Very interesting. I want to read and learn more about him, but he apparently wrote a lot about the family as the place where each person is loved into being by other people, by the people in the family. And through that love, that person is transformed and participates in the love of God. I think that's quite beautiful. That's quite fantastic. So let me just, for a moment, go back to this idea or this concept of autonomy. One of the criticisms I've made often about the so-called Anglo-American conservative tradition is that it overemphasizes sometimes the autonomy and liberty and free will of the individual at the expense of the broader context, the society, the family, that the environment in which the individual is embedded. And to be fair, the Anglo-American conservative tradition, which has emphasized liberty, as I said, has done great work in defending individuals against the technocratic state, the techno-feudal state, the soft totalitarianism of the left, and against the regulatory capture of civil society. But it's been somewhat unsuccessful at the same time, because it's carried with it this assumption that the individual is fully autonomous and can choose his or her path in life. We do have that freedom, but the problem is people today are choosing without knowing what their purpose is as individuals, as sons and daughters of God. And we know, because others have written about this very eloquently, that freedom emptied of this transcendent realm, this transcendent understanding, is not freedom, but it's slavery to passions. We've all heard that before. That is why I think this conference, and for me in particular, and I feel very delighted to be here in Romania, is so important, because we're bringing up questions. This conference is providing an opportunity to bring up questions about what the East can teach the West, because the West and its institutions that used to form individuals seems so corrupted by so many factors. And the East, I think, still has retained so many beautiful things, so many treasured things. The Byzantium in general has been called by Mihail, again, where is he? Ah, there he is, thank you. I keep referring to you because your call for papers was so wonderful. But he calls Byzantium the Great Bridge, and I think it has to serve as a great bridge for us, and should. My final comments, let me just return briefly to the young group of Catholic Europeans who I met last summer in this cafe in Vienna. They had read everything, they understood this tradition, but they didn't know how to live in this world that we're in today. I think their predicament is, as I said, our predicament. We have the arguments. We know the arguments. We have the books. We have the scholars like Dan who can show us the way. But when you have to live it day to day, that's really where the struggle is. And what our civilization, both East and West, used to provide through those institutions is no longer there. And I don't know what we can do about it. Perhaps we can discuss it today. One final thing, let me close with this, because as I said, I'm new to the world of Byzantium, and I'm fascinated. And I'm fascinated by so many aspects of it, but in particular, and I'll have to read my notes here, Byzantium shows us a society, a civilization where the gospel determines the structure of society and the position of the individual within that society. And Byzantium shows us how an entire political, economic, social system and its structures can be impregnated with divine significance. And Byzantium shows us that in the end, it's got to be Christ himself that rules, not someone else with other purposes or other desires. Thank you very much for listening.
Molto interessante, grazie mille. Last but not least, Mr. Andrzej Kolarik from Slovakia, from Vladislav Hanus Institute.
For having me. there is much to be said about how institutions and different civilizations shape the identity of the person. Perhaps an interesting way to approach this issue is to ask what different civilizations think about what is man's role on this universe, on this earth, or to put it in the words how the Czech sociologist Jaroslav Krejci described it, what is man's predicament? As we try to answer this question, we distill it to a higher and higher level of abstraction, and we find that there is ultimately only a handful of answers to this question. So if we move from east to west, first we can take a visit in ancient China, where we find this Kratocentric perspective that man exists within a set of hierarchical relationships which imply also certain duties and certain obligations, such as the filial piety of the son towards his father, or the obedience of the governed to the emperor and to the state. And the emphasis then lies in maintaining the hierarchy, preserving the proper order of relationships, and obeying established authority. As we cross the Himalayas, we come to India, where there is a different paradigm, a psychocentric paradigm, which focuses much more on the soul than the body, more on the spiritual than the material world. And existence is understood of having been in a cyclical nature, and then there is the cycle of birth, death, reincarnation, and man's quest is to achieve nirvana and be liberated from this constant cyclical nature of existence. And therefore man should accept his current place in this world and just live with it, and perhaps in the next life he will be born to a better position. Then in ancient Egypt, where there was very few environmental or historical disruptions, there was a very predictable way of life. Nile had its regular floods, no outside invasions, and there was only one disturbing scandal. And this disturbing scandal was death. And therefore Egypt developed this thanatocentric perspective where life focused on preparing for the afterlife and trying to live with accordance to the cosmic order, Maat, and to answer in the cosmic trial after death, and live in such a way that he may attain a blessed afterlife. In Mesopotamia, and later in Canaan, and eventually in the Islamic world, a theocentric paradigm developed, where man is called to submit himself to the divine. In Sumer, he is explicitly created to be a servant of the gods. Sometimes he appears as even a toy in their hands, because, unlike the predictable floods of Egypt and the relatively peaceful historical surroundings in Mesopotamia, there was constant invasions either from the Zagros or from the desert, or there was unpredictable flooding of the Tigris and the Euphrates. In Islam, the word Islam itself in Arabic means submission, and man submits to God, and the divinity in Islam is so sublime that it is very difficult for man to develop personal relationships to God. And in this sense, the book of Job can be seen as almost possessing an Islamic character in this surrender before divine providence. And as Spengler puts it, the quintessential sacrament, either in Oriental Christianity being the baptism, where man joins this community of believers, or in Islam professing the Shahada, man basically states that thy will be done and tries to accept the divine will. If we cross the Atlantic into Mesoamerica, we find a very peculiar cosmocentric paradigm. There, man's duty is to uphold the continued existence of the universe and the cosmos, also through his own deeds and sacrifices. He believed that if there is no human sacrifice, then the sun will perhaps not have the energy to rise the following day. And we thought that the conquest of Hernán Cortés, when he conquered the Aztec Empire, that was the end of the cosmocentric paradigm. But it appears that this cosmocentric paradigm is making a return, as humanity is increasingly called to make more sacrifices, to sacrifice their industry, and to fast from further CO2 emissions by this action to save the climate from global warming and preserve the inhabitability of the earth. Of course, this is a different topic, but this is also a peculiar paradigm that we are returning to. But let us go to our own continent, Europe, where there is two more paradigms and two more understandings of man's place in the world. Ancient Greece developed an anthropocentric paradigm focused primarily on the present tense, not so much concerned with the future, not so much concerned with the past, but the present tense of human existence. And what mattered was living virtuously in this life, achieving glory through heroic deeds, also cultivating aristocratic and heroic mentality. The Greek gods were not ones with crocodile heads, as were the gods of Egypt, nor were they very far away, unreachable. No, they were very much human, lived on the Olympus, and sometimes engaged in petty plotting, as can be seen in the Greek epics. And as the Spanish philosopher Juan Donoso Cortés notes, that Greeks in the presence of Eastern priests sometimes appeared as children who appear to be adults but are merely children. But Christendom saw a synthesis of the Greek and the Oriental Abrahamic understanding, where the theocentric and the anthropocentric mentality come together more closely, to such extent that perhaps a new paradigm of human predicament develops, an ecclesiocentric one where man is, of course, reminded of his place in this world, but also engages in relation with God, because through Christianity, God became man, and this shaped the very way how we perceive reality. According to Oswald Spengler, in Europe we are focused slightly less on the sacrament of baptism, but more, for example, on the sacrament of confession, which is a very European one, where there is an individuality and man himself has to reflect on his wrongdoings, on his sins, and needs to confess them. So this presupposes a free will and an understanding of the individuality and an understanding of time. And as we look at the idea of the human person, how people perceive the world, there is something very peculiar about Christianity. We sometimes forget how Christianity shaped our own understanding. And the English historian Tom Holland once remarked, how difficult it was for him to comprehend the mentality of the Syrians, the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Romans, because their understanding of the human person greatly changed. Many secular historians try to look at the Roman Empire as a great fun, but then the Christians came with their Puritan sexual ethics and done away with it. But of course, this was true for a small minority of Roman males, but it was not that much fun for the women, for the slaves, and for all others, other conquered nations involved. So our modern understanding of human dignity, be it in a Christian or a secular perspective, is very strongly informed by this Christian understanding of human dignity, be it man or woman, be it free citizen or who were formerly slaves. So it is so persistent that we sometimes barely notice this nature, and it is like the water in which we swim in. So thank you very much. With this.
Dakujem. Dakujem means thank you in Slovak. My short question, and I expect short answer to Mr. Vlad Mureșan. Universities, high schools in whole Europe and United States of America as well are the fields of the battle against conservative values, against traditional values. Do you believe the real change of the situation? Do you believe in the bigger presence of conservative values in Romanian universities?
You mean if I believe we could change that trend?
Well, frankly speaking, the question is my privilege in this debate. Please answer.
I wanted just to make sure I understood the question. Well, of course, a difficult notion. What I think is that people have lived on illusions based mostly on the European identification of the European project with prosperity. And since we are on a recessionary trend, more people will wake up that it's not just about material happiness, material progress, and this identification of Europe with material progress. And there's more to it than just so that people will wake up to more conservative values.
Okay, thank you. And question to Mr. Fantini. You are editor-in-chief of very important, very influential conservative media. What should the main priorities for conservative media in Europe? What's your opinion in our battle for normality?
May I rephrase the question, make sure I address and satisfy you? What the priorities should be for global conservative media, well, here in Europe, especially if I had $1 million, what would I do? What I would do is foment, support, help strengthen, and even set up dissident media outlets across this continent. And in each country, national level kind of media platforms, they can be digital or old-fashioned print like mine. I think we need to fill that media space with alternatives to provide people with the information, the data, the analysis, the commentary, the opinion that they're not getting from the mainstream and legacy media outlets. That are very powerful, very well funded, and very, very progressive, as you know. So that's what I would do. I hope I satisfied you.
Well, thank you for that, grazie. And one question to Andrei. Slovakia is one of the most Christian countries in Europe still, and thank you for that. I would like to ask you about in your opinion, what's the biggest dangers for your country in this issue, and also biggest hopes?
There is something that needs to be done. Slovakia, we have a deep gorge that separates the nationalists or the national conservatives from the Christian conservatives. And this gorge needs to be bridged because otherwise the conservatives are divided and find it very, very hard to cooperate and achieve results.
Not so optimistic message, but okay, maybe realistic. My question to organizers, we have time for the debate with audience. If yes, please, somebody want to ask? Man from the last row, please.
Okay. How should a spiritual revival of Christianity look like across Europe nowadays, in your opinion?
Thank you. Firstly, Mr. Muresan.
I can only think of a sort of civilizational anamnesis, remembrance about the roots of right now. When you have a crisis, it opens up dogmas. So you can in times of crisis, you have a fracture of the conscience. Then people can go deeper and remember their own roots. That's what's happening today. Progress means somehow self-alienation, self-negation, going always outside yourself in an ever-moving process of finding some new utopia, cornucopia, and change everything so you can attain some sort of world mundane paradise on earth. But when crisis hits, it opens up the conscience so you can go back again into yourself and actually remembering the roots of your own identity and civilization. This is what will happen imminently in Europe, I believe.
Thank you. The micro for Mr. Mario Fantino.
Same. The working one. How to bring about a spiritual revival in Europe, I think was the question. A couple of comments. First, I think there are things that we can learn from our evangelical brothers and sisters in the sense that they are unashamed to talk about religion and Christ. And I think Catholics, I don't know what it's like in the Orthodox world, but I often sense that there's we're a little embarrassed to bring up Christ or that topic with certain people in certain environments. So that's one thing. And the other thing, which is probably even more controversial, but some scholars in Denmark have been writing about this, is that we should be, in addition to talking about remigration, we should also be talking about the conversion of Muslims in Europe to our faith, to the Christian faith. I'm sure that'll open up a can of worms, but thank you.
Andrei?
I would say that quite often we Christians are concerned to be the sugar, to be so sweet, but we then forget to be the salt of the earth. We then forget to be the witnesses of the truth. And we need to change that. There is situations where aggiornamento has gone too far, and we need to be the ones who bring the clarity, to bring the message of the gospel. And once we do this and stop echoing the noise of this world, but preach the Christian message, then the evangelization will actually spread the good news.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to add very quickly to what Andrei said.
No
because
for you.
It makes me think of, in the political realm, the same message is true. We have for too long been too polite and we've wanted to be gentlemen and ladies, as I was talking about in my speech, and we don't want to disrupt things. I think the times we live in today require disruption, confrontation, greater boldness, courage, and sometimes perhaps to be a little bit less polite than we normally might be. And that's all I want to say.
Thank you. Somebody else? Please, Professor.
I wanted to ask you about the resurgence of the mythological in contemporary societies and also Eastern religion. It seems, following your kind of dialectical presentation of the spiritual progress of the West, there's been a significant regression. Nietzsche called it a new Buddhism, but among demi-sophisticated people, there's a sort of preference for Eastern religions that are non-monotheistic. In America, it often takes the form, I call it breathing Buddhism, a kind of narcissistic emphasis on the self, the inner, and a kind of comfort with a metaphysics of annihilation. In the end, the goal is the extinction of ego. And of course, that goes hand in hand with this philosophy of autonomy, of self-assertion. But what do you think is responsible for, Chantal Delsol in France has published a book arguing that, I think she goes too far, but she argues that, not only Christendom, but important elements of Christianity seem to be moribund, that modern man has a preference for the mythological, for the religions of the self, a kind of suspicion of transcendental religion and all that. And there's something in the air, And at the same time, we see a significant resurgence of faith in traditional religion on the part of some of the young, at least. Certainly a phenomenon in France and the United States. What do you make of that? How does that fit into your presentation of the dialectic of the finite and infinite?
I hope it works. Yeah. Of course, we have a metaphysical triangle. It's God, nature, and man. Right. I began by insisting polytheistic tradition was finite, a sort of dilation of the finite. You have finite essences, like there's no infinite God, but a sort of inflationary worshipping of finite essences. Now we're back somehow there, because if you reject the synthesis between the ultimate religion, what Hegel calls the absolute religion, Christianity, which is the incarnated unity of God and man, if you break this up, you have man against God, which is modern atheist religion. You yourself presented it as a religion of humanity. So if you eliminate God, all that remains is man and nature. So we have worship of humanity and worship of nature. It's either environmental ecosophia, cosmolatria, which is basically pagan mythology revived, or you have anthropolatria, which is self-deification, self-glorification of man, with the mythological tendency of Nietzsche, like the Übermensch expectation, or with the narcissistic, hedonistic deification of minor humanity, I would call it. So that's absolutely logical that people will find idols once they suspend the real absolute divinity.
I dare not reply.
I would perhaps add to this that we have reached this zenith of rationality, the zenith of modernity, and we are going back to this second religiousness that has happened in a similar way in the Roman Empire and in ancient China and in ancient India. So more interest in religion to come.
Thank you. I propose the last question. Please, on the left side or right side here, please. micro. Good run.
Well, European and Western civilization actually based on its elite that were formed in universities that are by excellence Christian monastical institutions. Well, after Antonio Gramsci's long march to institution and the left putting its hands on academia and basically transforming the Western world, do you find it feasible to create a wave, let's say, of a conservative long march through institutions to gain control over academia? And if yes, where should we start from?
Richard.
I propose from this side now. Yeah.
Oh. Okay. Does it work now? All right, good. So the left has already understood how it is important to take over the institutions, and they have done so. And it seems that they would not be very happy and open to see a conservative takeover of the institutions, and they will be very sensitive to any such attempt. So perhaps the alternative is to establish conservative alternative universities, alternative ways of educating young people and bringing them to familiar with the classical European inheritance. In Slovakia, we have the College of Anton Neuwirth, which is officially an informal university, but it is very formal, and it wanted to bring this tasting of the Oxford University to Slovakia, offering a 1 or 2 year intense academic course in civic education. So perhaps this could be a model to inspire.
Thank you. I think Andre put it very well, but I'll complement it a little bit. It's one of the ongoing discussions with a lot of my friends, like, do we adopt Gramscian methods to take back our institutions as some European governments have tried? I think it's a very valuable and worthwhile discussion to have. At the same time, I've also seen many people use the same kind of argument. Like, for example, I'm going to work on Wall Street for 2 years, make enough money, and then I'll give money to the conservative groups. But what happens is, because we're weak and fallible creatures, you get pulled into a world. And so my friends who used to say this are still 20 years later on Wall Street, for example. And other friends would say, well, I got accepted into Oxford University. I'm a conservative, so I'm going to go there, get my credentials, and then I'll fight the civilizational battle. But what happens is they go to Oxford, they get enamored and tempted by everything that Oxford and that prestigious academic world offers. And again, being fallible creatures, they're pulled into a world, and then 10 years later they say, well, I'm no longer as conservative as I used to be. I've grown up. I'm mature now. So I think there's a danger. And so I agree with what Andre said. We should actually be building our own new institutions, and not just universities and schools and kindergartens, but, as I said earlier, media outlets, new banking systems and financial structures, new server farms so that we don't get canceled by the big tech companies. We need to build basically a whole countercultural infrastructure for our side.
Just one small mention. I've observed an increasing bureaucratic ideological colonization of university, which is top to bottom from, I believe, Brussels, DEI prescriptions, which are basically conditioning your ranking or teaching or even research with some indicators, top to bottom, imposed, canonizing topics like how does your course contribute to whether environmental inclusion, equity, gender-based equality, or all sorts. How you, if you teach archaeology, how does that contribute to environmental equality, or how does that contribute to gender equality if you're, I don't know, teaching Spengler or, I don't know, Latin language or history of Moldavia. So it's encroaching upon, ideological encroaching upon your teaching assignment, which very much reminds me of communist activists when I was a child. Doing nothing else than observing some sort of ideological compliance, which is, you know, European university was based on university autonomy, and this is political bureaucratic control from outside the academia, interjecting themselves into research and teaching. So we should perhaps deconstruct this bureaucratic encroachment into university and reassert the autonomy of university and autonomy of scientific thinking and cognitive development.
Thank you.
Înțeleg, dar nu vorbesc. Așa mare. Foarte interesant subiectele care s-au dezbătut aici și mă bucur că pot fi prezent la asemenea dezbatere. E posibil să fie un pic incomod una sau chiar și a doua întrebare. Prima eu adresez domnului Mahoney și vreau să-i...
The first question I want to ask is for Mr. Mahoney.
Să-l adaug în completare pe lângă Karl și Marx și pe Engels, care a lucrat la lucrarea Manifestul Comunist.
And I would like to add also Marx that wrote the Communist Manifesto.
Și dacă consideră dumnealui pe lângă
I would like to ask you if you think that
ideea principală care a fost de fapt și cea care a dus la Revoluție de a declasa burghezia, a avut și o tentă creștină vis-a-vis de a anihila creștinismul.
And please tell us if you think that the main idea of getting rid of the bourgeoisie had also a Christian. Puteți să mai repetați?
O spun asta în ideea că în regimul comunist erau practic prigoniți preoții și cei care mergeau la biserică.
Also by putting down the bourgeoisie, there was also a Christian puteți să repetați? Subtext. And if there was also if the Christians were also involved in this.
I would say perhaps formally or superficially, but look, Christ warns against worldliness of all kinds, because those who put their faith in mammon or wealth often forget their dependence on the Creator God. Marxism has no difference whatsoever with the market economy or the bourgeois society about the desirability of embourgeoisement, of riches, of commercial development. It's an in-house debate about what is the best means of doing so. So I think, sure, you can certainly find prophetic utterances in the Old Testament. you can find words of Christ warning against both wealth and worldliness. But you certainly don't have any call for class struggle, for political despotism, and of course, the language of the poor in spirit suggests that being empirically poor, having less while others have more, is no guarantee of righteousness or holiness. No, I think the claim that Christianity and Marxism share some kind of common values is more false than true, and was often used by communist ideologues and regimes to as a cover for the fundamental animosity toward the Christian religion and for any transcendental truths. So on the whole, I don't agree with that characterization.
Final words? No. Okay. I think it's a very good conclusion of our debate. Thank you very much indeed for our excellent panelists. Time for applause for them. And good news, because now we have time for coffee break. Thank you.